What's up, nerds? There's weirdly been a lot happening in Afghanistan since the US withdrew, and we need to talk about what's happened. Of course, both Iran and Pakistan have had growing security challenges with the Taliban along their border with Afghanistan, but Afghanistan itself has gone through some pretty radical changes, and some issues within the country might be increasing the amount of security concerns that those neighboring countries might have. And of course, all of this will impact Central Asian security for years to come. Some of those changes we learned about during a recent congressional testimony with Generals Mark Milley and another general who oversees the Central Command during the evacuation, and it's disturbing. We need to talk about that as well. Of course, I'm recording this video on March 20th, 2024. So as you know, it was basically as the US was withdrawing, not necessarily after, but as it happened, the Taliban basically claimed control over the entire country of Afghanistan. Of course, the evacuation was a complete mess, it was incredibly sloppy, and it was even very deadly. And while the U.S. was able to evacuate up to 100,000 Afghans and other U.S. citizens, it was not able to evacuate everybody. So a lot of Afghans were left behind under Taliban control, and things have gotten very deadly for them. The evacuation also left Afghanistan's neighbors to deal with the growing security challenges. But a lot of people at the time didn't feel as bad because we were basically withdrawing so that the new moderate and cool new Taliban could take over and that they wouldn't be as bad as the old Taliban, right? Well, by November 2022, the Taliban had reinstituted public flogging and public executions, as well as having banned women from parks, universities, gyms, and from working in the United Nations. In fact, the UN calls these policies gender apartheid. These policies have been so extreme that the Taliban's closest allies in Qatar and China were even caused to gasp a little bit. Which you've got to be pretty crazy to get China and Qatar to freak out. Clearly, this is not the cool new Taliban. This is the old same Taliban from before. But the Taliban also clearly doesn't really care what the outside world thinks. They're just going to do their own thing. Their harassment of aid workers and anger over their policies against women have led to over a $1 billion reduction in UN funding for Afghanistan. And in that anger, over 9 million Afghans are at risk of starvation. That aid basically took away their food security. Further crackdowns on opium growth throughout Afghanistan have also taken out a key economic lever within Afghanistan, and that might also lead to some economic risk, which could of course lead to more starvation. Now, what exactly has happened to the Afghans who helped the United States during the occupation? Well, nothing good. And in a congressional testimony with Generals Mark Milley and General Frank McKenzie, both of whom oversaw the evacuation in Kabul, they testified with Congress to basically go over the evacuation and what all happened and what has happened since. We learned some new things about what had happened. Of course, they lay the rush withdrawal at the feet of the State Department, saying that it was the State Department's call for when the evacuation was going to happen. And simply put, they had the assets in place, but the call was too late and too rushed. But they also provided additional details on what happened to the Afghans who had helped the coalition over 20 years. General Mike Milley said,
"Some of the Afghans were tracked down that worked with us, and I think some of them were killed, and I'm pretty certain some of them in pretty brutal ways. Some were managed to escape through various means. Others have just laid low and keeping their heads down."
Now, clearly, Afghanistan is enduring some absolutely terrible conditions. Conditions that the Taliban will have to answer and show an answer for their people to continue to support them well into the future. Water shortages have been a huge challenge for Afghanistan. This has led to a small conflict with Iran over control over the Helmand River. And the UN is still actively trying to avert a famine in Afghanistan with over $2.9 billion flowing into Afghanistan. But it's here that things start to get a little bit more complicated because, again, this is a Taliban-controlled government, and the majority of that aid is coming from the United States. And if you remember, whenever the U.S. withdrew, that many U.S. officials stated that U.S. taxpayer money would not end up in the hands of the Taliban. Well, we've found out since that that's not exactly the case. Some of that $2.9 billion that is aid to Afghanistan has, of course, ended up in the hands of the Taliban by way of the Afghan Central Bank, which, of course, now that the Taliban's government, of course, the central bank is under the control of the Taliban. There are a few controls over the central bank to curtail things like money laundering and just taking money out altogether. And because of the lack of banking infrastructure in Afghanistan, a lot of this money has to be delivered in raw cash. Now, a lot of this money does include U.S. funds. In fact, most of the UN cash to Afghanistan comes from U.S. taxpayers. In fact, to hammer the point, the U.S. remains the largest aid donor to Afghanistan today. And some congressional representatives have become very angry and upset about this, lodging complaints, saying that we are sending money to the Taliban. That wasn't the plan. But again, concern over this is kind of silly. The Taliban is not just some rogue terrorist group anymore. I mean, they kind of are, but they're also the actual government of Afghanistan. It's going to be kind of hard to avoid dealing with a government when delivering humanitarian aid to the people of a country. Of course, there's concern that this aid to the Taliban might allow it to continue to grow in strength and that the Taliban might continue to harbor other groups that could attack the United States. There's the claim, of course, within the Department of Defense and from the White House that the U.S. can observe terrorism and can prevent these kinds of attacks without having boots on the ground. And we've seen some U.S. actions in Afghanistan since the withdrawal. However, I think it is understandable that U.S. taxpayer money ending up in the Afghan central bank is a bit of a problem. And if we don't want the kids of the future to be making 9/11 Part 2 jokes on social media, then we've got to be a bit more careful with where we're sending our money. But at the same time, I also think that it's incredibly challenging because we are dealing with an urgent famine right now. That I do think that it's right that the U.S. should be at the forefront at trying to prevent a famine. And it's incredibly difficult to do that whenever the government of that country is a terrorist group that we literally just fought a 20-year war against. And they may be taking some of that money that we're giving that is earmarked for aid for other purposes. So the conditions in Afghanistan are decidedly bad, and there's not really a lot that can be done about it at this time. But surely these conditions are so bad that that's prevented the Taliban from attacking their neighbors, right? Right? Of course not. Of course, we've already mentioned the clashes that's happened between the Taliban and Iran over control of the Helmand River, over water rights. And of course, water is going to continue to play a huge role for Afghan security well into the future, not just for agricultural, but really just drinking water. But there's more happening between the Taliban and Pakistan, especially lately. Of course, before we proceed here, it helps to know that there are kind of two Talibans at play here. There's the Afghan Taliban, the Taliban that rules Afghanistan that we've been talking about to this point. There's also the Pakistan Taliban, or the TTP, which has long fought the Pakistani government and really has it actively against the Pakistani government. They want to create a Sharia state in Pakistan and unify the tribal lands in the north and the west of Pakistan, but also overthrow the Pakistani government to create that Islamic state. Really, the TTP and the Afghan Taliban are two different franchises of the same crappy fast food chain, except instead of fast food, it's Islamic Jihad. And instead of them having a corporate office that oversees both, they're really just they share the same brand name. They really they have similar menu items and they like to do the same stuff, but sometimes they'll do their own thing. During the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, the TTP provided shelter for the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan, which allowed the Afghan Taliban to basically launch cross-border raids into Afghanistan and then have safe shelter in Pakistan. This became a huge clash between the United States and Pakistan throughout the war, where the U.S. wanted Pakistan to take these issues more seriously, and to some degree they kind of did, but we're going to talk more about this situation here in just a moment. But of course, today with the Afghan Taliban taking over Afghanistan, they've been providing shelter for the TTP, and it's kind of the inverse situation where instead of the attacks attacking U.S. forces, they're attacking Pakistan. Now, this recent saga more or less kicked off. I mean, of course, there were attacks prior, but we can just say that on March 16th, there was a suicide attack on a Pakistani border checkpoint in North Waziristan. This killed 7 Pakistani soldiers. Of course, Pakistan retaliated by launching an airstrike in Afghanistan, which is believed to have killed 8. And Pakistan says that those 8 were members of the TTP, but the Afghan Taliban say that those were civilians. Pakistan also launched a raid within North Waziristan, killing another 8, which they said were members of the TTP. Now, this suicide attack was not the only attack in Pakistan. In fact, over the past year, there have been over 650 attacks in Pakistan, with over 1,000 killed, and around 93% of those attacks were along the border of Afghanistan. And Pakistan claims that the majority of those attacks were carried out by the TTP. They even say that the rate of these attacks has increased since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. The spike in these attacks could be because of the Taliban sanctioning and protection of the TTP. It could also be likely that the Afghan Taliban just isn't even able to control what's going on in their own borders. After all, they're not the only group in Afghanistan. There are other groups that exist. Now, of course, after the Pakistani airstrikes in Afghanistan, the Taliban responded with mortar strikes in Islamabad, as well as an exchange of fire across the border, which killed another Pakistani officer and injured 2 others. The escalating fighting along the border has led to the evacuation of civilians. It's also led to another round of Pakistani airstrikes in Afghanistan, and this whole situation really doesn't show any sign of stopping. In fact, during a recent funeral in Afghanistan, some Afghan Taliban leaders honored the loss of their dead and claim that they will have revenge over Pakistan. And I gotta say that there is some huge irony at play here, because not only is Pakistan dealing with increasing security challenges with the Afghan Taliban, they really didn't go after the TTP or the Afghan Taliban as aggressively as the US wanted during the war. In fact, not only that, they actually supported the Taliban during the war and even supported the Taliban during its takeover of Afghanistan. They not only supported them with providing intelligence, but they also provided them with logistics and money. Now, yes, they did receive pressure from the United States to help go after parts of the Taliban, and they did help to some degree. But they've also actively helped the Taliban throughout the conflict as well. It definitely does say something that Osama bin Laden was killed in Islamabad, just miles away from their military academy. Now, present day, Pakistan is having to deal with the TTP and the Afghan Taliban, and guess what? India didn't go anywhere, and the United States is not going to help. Needless to say, the chickens are coming home to roost, and Pakistan is about to be full of chicken crap. Now, I want to hear your thoughts about this whole situation, because certainly it's more complicated than what we've talked about today. There's a lot more that's happened since the evacuation, and this could go in multiple different directions. I feel like the Taliban have kind of become this wild card in Central Asia that could impact everybody's plans. I mean, China has plans to continue to expand economically westward with the Belt and Road Initiative, but if the Afghan Taliban don't play ball, then that could be a problem for China. I mean, they really could be a problem for just about anybody. And for decades, the U.S. had been kind of like the stabilizing factor holding them down. But now that the U.S. is gone, I mean, who's going to keep them down? But yet still, despite all of this, the Afghan people are still suffering behind all of this. So I want to hear your thoughts about this, and be sure to subscribe to this channel if you're interested in more conversations about international affairs and security, because this is the place to have it. With all that, I'll see y'all later. Bye.